day, children. So in the previous class we had seen that Mrs. Pearson, she says to George that the people make fun of him. They call him Pompey Pearson. And George doesn't agree with this. So when Doris comes, when Cyril comes in, so she asks him, she confirms from him that is it the thing is happening when he goes to the bar. So he says yes. And then Mr. George, he gets very angry and he goes away from there. After that, when he goes away, Mrs. Pearson and Cyril are left in the room. So Cyril says to his mother, "Mother, you shouldn't have told him like this. It is not good. We have hurt him." So Mrs. Pearson said, it's good for us sometimes to hurt people because the truth hurts people. And if your father didn't go to the club, perhaps they'll stop laughing at it. So every time your father goes to the club, he should stop going over there, and then the people will stop laughing at him. So Cyril also says, yes, it's true. And Mrs. Pearson then says, possibly you do, but what I doubt is whether your opinion worth having. What do you want? No, nothing. You spend too much time and good money at greyhound races and dirt tracks and ice shows. And then she's saying that I know your opinion is also worthwhile, and the thing is that you all spend so much money on the other things like races, dirt tracks, ice shows, and all these things. So Cyril asks, if I spend such a lot of money, then I enjoy that. So Mrs. Pearson says, I wouldn't mind so much if you were really enjoying yourself, but are you? And where is it getting you? And then she says, if you are enjoying, then it's good, but this thing is taking you somewhere else. So Cyril says, might be for me, I'll see. So he said, okay, I'll see what to do. And then Cyril re-enters and the door behind him closes. And then he says that because somebody knocked at the door, so he went out and he went to see who is that. Then he comes in and says that it's silly old bag, Mrs. Fitzgerald has come to see you. And you don't want her here, do you? And he asks the mother that do you want her to come in? So she says, don't say like this to her. She's not a silly old bag. She's a good woman, and yes, I want to see her, and she has got more senses than you all. And then Cyril goes out, and then Mrs. Fitzgerald comes in with him, and Mrs. Pearson, she greets Fitzgerald and she says, come in. Miss Fitzgerald, she says, I just wondered if everything is all right. So she was having the spirit of Mrs. Pearson, and she was very much worried about the family. She wanted to see what was going on. So she said, okay, I wanted to know whether everything was all right. So Cyril said, no, it isn't. Cyril didn't know what is it. So he said, nothing is good going on in the family. So Mrs. Pearson says, you keep quiet. Mrs. Pearson, who was having the spirit of Fitzgerald, she says, you keep quiet. And then Cyril, he says, why should I be quiet? Mrs. Pearson says, because I tell you, you are a spoiled person. And Mrs. Fitzgerald, oh no, surely, Mrs. Fitzgerald, because she was the mother, she was having the spirit of Mrs. Pearson, and she was kind towards her family members. So she says, no, he's not. So Mrs. Pearson, she says, Mrs. Fitzgerald, you just let me manage my family. Mrs. Fitzgerald, she didn't want the Miss Fitzgerald in spirit. She did not want interference of Mrs. Pearson because she was trying to bring the family right. So Mrs. Fitzgerald, yes, but Cyril. Then Cyril says, Mr. Cyril person to please Mrs. Fitzgerald. So when she calls him Cyril, so Cyril gets angry and he says, call me Mr. Cyril Pearson. Then Mrs. Fitzgerald says, oh dear, what's happening? So here the mother, her heart is feeling bad for the family. So she was thinking, what is going on in the family? Mrs. Pearson says, nothing much, just putting them in their places, that's all, doing what you ought to have done long since. So Mrs. Pearson, she says that I am just putting the family in the place, proper place. This you would have done previously, long back you could have done this. So Mrs. Fitzgerald, she says, is George home? And then she sits. Mrs. Pearson, yes, I've been telling him what they think of him at the club. So Mrs. Pearson, she says, I told George what people think of him. Mrs. Pearson and Mrs. Pearson's spirit that was in Fitzgerald, she says, they think a lot of him, don't they? No, they don't. And now he knows it. So Mrs. Fitzgerald was having the spirit of Pearson. She says ki people think good of him. So Mrs. Pearson having Fitzgerald's spirit, she says no. They don't think good of him, and I have told him ki what people think of him. And he knows it very well. Then Mrs. Fitzgerald said, oh dear, I wish you hadn't, Mrs. Fitzgerald. So she said, why did you tell him? I wish you didn't tell him. Mrs. Pearson, nonsense, doing them all a world of good, and they'll be eating out of your hand soon, you'll see. And then Mrs. Pearson said, they should know what is going on in the world, and that's why I'm making them good. And if again you'll be kind to them, then they will again start order you. So I don't think I want them eating out of my hand. So Mrs. Fitzgerald says, I don't bother about that. I love my family. So Mrs. Pearson says, well, whatever you want, they'll be doing it, all three of them. Mark my words, Mrs. Pearson. Then Mrs. Pearson, who was having the spirit of Mrs. Gerald, she said, don't worry, three of them will be all right, and whatever you'll say to them, they will do it. Then George enters, the husband enters the room, and he's not at all happy, and he sees the visitor and he's very much surprised because previously his wife did not like her, and this time Mrs. Pearson and Fitzgerald both were sitting and talking to each other, and then they were looking at him when he came in. So George said, just looked in for a minute, I suppose, Mrs. Fitzgerald. So he said to Mrs. Fitzgerald, I hope you have come for a little while to visit us. So Mrs. Fitzgerald said, well, yes, I suppose so, George. Then she calls him George. So George, he's very much surprised that she's calling me George. Mrs. Fitzgerald, oh, I'm sorry. Mrs. Pearson, what does it matter? Your name's George, isn't it? Why do you think you are Duke of Edinburgh? So Mrs. Pearson, having the spirit of Mrs. Gerald, she says, so what? Your name is George, so she's calling you George. You're not the Duke of Edinburgh, you're not the king, you're not the monarch of Edinburgh. George, what's he got to do with it? Just tell me that. And isn't it bad enough without her calling me George? And George was feeling bad because she straight off took his name. Naughty Pompey Pearson, and poor Doris has been crying her eyes out upstairs. Yes, crying her eyes out. So he said, what's the matter? Now she's calling me George and you are accepting it. And you call me Ompy Pompey Pearson. And you made Doris also cry. She has been crying over there for so long. So Mrs. Fitzgerald, oh dear, I ought to have known. So Mrs. Fitzgerald, she was so impatient because she was the mother. And she said, what happened? I want to know. So George, you ought to have known. Why ought you have to know? Means why you want to know about it. Nothing to do with you. And George said, nothing to do with you, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Look, we are at 6s and 7s here just now. So perhaps you'll excuse us. So he said, we are having the argument among ourselves. So you better be quiet and you go away from here. So Mrs. Pearson, she says to him, I won't excuse you, Mr. George. Next time a friend and neighbor comes to see me, just say something when you see her, good evening or how do you do or something, and don't just march in and sit down without a word. It's bad manners. So Mrs. Pearson is giving advice to George. If next time anybody comes to meet me, you just say good evening or you wish in whatever way you want, and you just don't march in and sit down when we are sitting and talking, because this is a bad manner. So Mrs. Fitzgerald, she said, no, it's all right. Mrs. Pearson, no, it isn't all right. We have some decent manners in this house, or I'll know the reason why. Well, and then she said, no, this is not good. There are some decent manners. You should accept the decent manners in the house, and I know the reason then. George, well, what? So George is arguing now. He's saying, what happened? So Mrs. Pearson, why don't you get off to your club? So she said, you go to your club. Special night tonight, isn't it? Today you are going to have special night over there. They'll be waiting for you, wanting to have a good laugh. Go then. Don't disappoint them. So she said, you wanted to go to the club and you wanted to enjoy, and they must be waiting for you to have a laugh at you. So you go and don't disappoint them. So George gets angry. He says, that's right. Make me look silly in front of her now. Now he's saying the guest has come and you are making fun of me in front of her also. Go on, don't mind. She said, you keep on making fun of me. I don't mind about it. Poor Doris been crying her eyes out, getting the neighbors in to see the fun. And Doris has been crying for so long, and you want the neighbor to see what is going on in the family. All right, let her hear it. What's the matter with you? Have you gone balmy or what? Then he said, all right, you want to make fun of your family in front of other people, so you do it, and then I don't know what has happened to you. You have gone crazy. So Mrs. Pearson, if you shout at me again like that, George Pearson, I'll slap your big bad face. So she gets angry that if you're going to shout at me, I'll slap you. Mrs. Fitzgerald, oh no, Mrs. Fitzgerald. And then she sits. George, either I'm off my chum or you too. And George, he's very much surprised when Mrs. Fitzgerald called the other lady Fitzgerald. Then he says, don't know what's happening. Have you gone crazy? No, please, Mrs. Fitzgerald. Look, you are Fitzgerald. So why are you telling yourself to stop when you are not doing anything? So he says to Fitzgerald that you are Fitzgerald, and why you are saying to Fitzgerald, you keep quiet. When you are not hurting me, you are not saying anything to me, then why you are saying to me to keep quiet? Tell her to stop. Then there will be some sense in it. Think you must be Teddy. And then he said, tell her to stop because she is going crazy and she is shouting at me. So Mrs. Pearson, say that again, Mr. Pearson, George Pearson. So Mrs. Pearson says to George, say that again. So George says, all right. And then after that, Doris enters, and then she's looking very miserable because she has been crying. She's still wearing the wrap, Mrs. Pearson sits on the settee, and then Mrs. Pearson sits in the place. So that's all for today, children. This is the fourth part, and hopefully in the next class we will be completing this, because 5 more pages have been left. So good day, children.